Welcome to a lecture about postmodernism and the postmodern era in modern American lit. I wanted to give you kind of an idea of some of the key ideologies and characteristics of the literature and art during the postmodern era. But I wanted to do that. I wanted to look forward to what you're going to encounter and what you're already encountering in your reading by looking back at the two previous eras that we've discussed. So, what we began our semester with way back in January was realism. Then we moved to modernism, which is the era that we just finished. And now we are beginning to read literature of the postmodern era. As you'll recall, the realistic literary era really took place primarily in the 19th century, the late 19th century, just after the ending of the Civil War. The modern era is primarily considered to have occurred during the early 20th century, and the postmodern era is considered to have taken place during the mid 20th century. And I just wanted to point out that these three dates are really, it's not like somebody issued forth a proclamation that said, as of the end of World War II, I hereby declare that this will be the postmodern era. These are just kind of general umbrellas that kind of help us understand the general time frame and the ideas and the characteristics of the art during these eras. So, here are the characteristics of and the thoughts of the realistic era. You'll recall that realistic writers and artists place a very high value on careful observation of reality. They don't believe in including sentiment or idealism in their writing, and they really put an emphasis on giving readers or audiences a detailed portrayal of life. They're really looking at what's happening in the actual real lived experiences that they're having and that their characters are having, and they're trying to tell the truth about that. You'll recall that we talked about the local color movement of literature, and that's where writers and artists are depicting characters and events that occur in very definitive times and places. One of the things that happened in the literature and art of the realistic era is that there was a broadening of the kinds of people that were portrayed in the art. We had not just upper class or the noble class or the wealthy. We start to see middle class and even working class individuals, and of course, additional races being represented in this art, different ethnicities. This art is also not shying away from focusing in or giving us information about the kinds of details and imagery and topics that previously might have been considered sordid or disturbing. And by untidy, kind of what I mean is these works of art don't end up in a clean, pretty conclusion. Everything isn't tied up in a nice bow. There's not a happy, shiny ending. Instead, many times things are left untidy, things are left unsettled, things are left unresolved. You'll also recall that regionalism and naturalism also occurred as kind of offshoots of the realistic era. Regionalism, again, kind of focusing on cultures in particular parts of the country. Naturalism focusing on kind of the devolving of humanity when it encounters the true elements of nature. You'll recall also that realism, and when you look at these traits, you can kind of see it, realism was a reaction to Romanticism and to the ideology of Romanticism. So instead of kind of making things look glossy and beautiful, unicorns and rainbows, instead, you've got kind of the harsher, truer details of life being depicted. And realistic artists and thinkers certainly privileged an emphasis on human reason and logic over a heavy emphasis or reliance on emotion, and they are not fans of sentimentality. So let's move into modernism, and hopefully all of this is kind of ringing some bells from things we talked about in our class sessions before. Like realism is a reaction to romanticism, modernism is a reaction to realism. Modernism rejects traditions and conventions, including those associated with realistic literature. And so, where realism said we are going to give a logical portrayal of life as it is and of the truth as it is, modernism says we reject the truths of realistic thinkers and romantic thinkers and thinkers of the Enlightenment, and instead, we're going to establish new traditions, new truths, new conventions, and new artistic forms. But modern writers are still relying on human logic to kind of craft and create and produce these new traditions and forms. Here are some of the qualities that you're going to see in modern art. Modern art is very experimental. It's avant-garde, sometimes radically so. It's trying really hard to be different than what has been produced previously, what has been created previously. You'll recall stream of consciousness. I see that I have stream of conscientiousness. That must be a Freudian slip. I'm trying to be very conscientious in my list. Stream of consciousness, as you'll recall in at least one of the texts that we read during the modern era that represented the modern era. Modern art is much more abstract. It's fragmented instead of whole. Many times the information given and the images given are very spare and sparse. So we don't get a lot of explanation or editorializing or narration going on. We just kind of get these images and these ideas and this dialogue kind of dropped at us, and we have to make sense of it. Many of the characters experience isolation and alienation, and really the writers of marginalized ethnicities characterized people in those ethnicities as aliens to the dominant culture. So again, you can see that as kind of one example of how the past traditions that were kind of celebrated and adhered to by the dominant culture, those ideas were being pushed back against by these non-white writers. Now we're going to shift to postmodernism, and following the same kind of pattern. Realists reacted to romanticists. Modernists reacted to realists. Postmodern thinkers and writers are reacting to modernism. And a lot of this is believed to have been caused by World War I and World War II, and how those catastrophic events really caused people to completely lose faith in humanity's ability to logically construct systems that work, methods that work, societies that work. And there was a real sense of horror and fear and despair about this kind of breakdown of all the ideas and thinking and practices and customs and beliefs that were adhered to previously. Here are some of the traits of postmodernism. Postmodernism and postmodern art, postmodern thinkers often practice what's called deconstructionism. Basically what that means is they take previous ideas, previous images, previous ideologies, previous forms of art, and they deconstruct them. And they do that because they no longer believe that those constructions are reliable. So they kind of dismantle them, take them apart. There is no longer a belief in the idea of a central hierarchy. You might also think of that as there's no longer a belief in one higher power, or even that there is a higher power, even if there are arguments about exactly what or who that higher power is. Postmodern thinkers would say that higher power doesn't exist, and so therefore kind of the hierarchy and the systemic structures that would follow from that no longer exist. Much of the art is characterized as hybrid. In other words, it's kind of a combination of many times completely unexpected and dissimilar elements. Another word to describe that is pastiche. Postmodern art and thought values outsiders and really celebrates nonconformists, people that are pushing back against that dominant culture and against the whole idea that there is even value in having a dominant culture. Postmodern art is ambiguous on purpose. If postmodern art had clear, definitive meaning, then it would be trying to forward a new truth. And of course, postmodern thought no longer believes in the existence of truth. So therefore, it has to be ambiguous. Many times, postmodern art is confessional, and this is because now postmodern thinkers say that the only truth that we know that we can have is the truth that results from our own individual, unique experience of the world. And so people are just confessing, artists are confessing rather than kind of espousing uh, any kind of ideology or philosophy. Much postmodern art is playful, and I'm going to try to get some of that into our reading. A lot of it is serious, but also a lot of it is really playful, sometimes in kind of a desperate or darkly humorous way, but also sometimes in a really joyous way, as if there's freedom in the idea that there's no longer this pressure to adhere to these norms, and there's no pressure anymore to find and articulate the singular universal truth. Postmodernism, again, puts a heavy emphasis on the experience of the individual and the uniqueness of each person's experience. And as a result of that, the meaning of art relies almost completely on the reader. It no longer matters whether an artist has an intent or a message. And again, artists often are trying to avoid any such thing. And that is because it's really up to the reader to create a message or an idea or to extract a truth from postmodern art. You're going to continue to see a diversity of voices, not just in the characters that are depicted, but in the ethnicities of the writers who are being published, the ideas that they're writing about, and also the readers to whom they're writing. The readership just continues to broaden as time advances. And one of the things I also want to point out is there's also an increasing diversity of media. So whereas in realism and in modernism, as far as the written word and ideas, we're relying on visual art and then the literary text. Now we've got television, we've got the internet, we've got YouTube videos, we've got tweets, we've got just a whole new universe of media by which ideas are being accessed and communicated. Where modern writers represented non-dominant ethnicities as aliens, postmodern writers are saying that race it's a construct. It doesn't even really exist. And so the idea of being racist, of discriminating against a particular ethnicity is ridiculous and is criminal, is evil. And so you're going to see even a harder pushing back against racism and really many kinds of isms that occur in society. So hopefully this just kind of gives you an idea of some of the central characteristics associated with realism, modernism, and postmodernism. I sort of like to examine postmodernism against the backdrop of realism and modernism. It just helps me make a little bit more sense of it. I hope that that's true for you as well. I kind of want to sum all of this up by giving you kind of the mantra for each of these eras. I think that you'll recall that realist writing placed a high value on telling the truth. So their mantra is tell the truth. We're going to tell the truth instead of romanticizing or trying to make things better than they are, make life seem better than it is. So, realistic art says if we keep integrity to the actual literal details that exist in our world, it is possible for us to find truth and for us to portray that truth in literature and art. The mantra for modernism, as you'll recall, is make it new. And the it in that mantra is the truth. So modern writers and thinkers would say that the way that we find new truth is by rejecting the old truth and creating that new truth, making it new. So they say that that is really the work of literature and art, which is to create and portray this new truth. Postmodernism then says truth is partial, truth is in question, and truth is completely relative to the individual person. Truth doesn't really exist then, it can't be found, and for that reason, any literature or art that claims to convey the universal truth or a universal truth is automatically deserving of our suspicion. So, there is an overview of realism, which says tell the truth, modernism, which says make the truth new, and postmodernism, which says truth is partial and is really in question and is relative to the individual. So I want you to, as you read the text that we read throughout the rest of the semester, I want you to see hints and glimmers and suggestions of these ideas and these characteristics in the texts that we read. See if you see literary forms, characters, ideas, beliefs, actions, even settings that are illustrations of the postmodern tradition. The other thing that I think it's worth thinking about is what do you think about these different eras? Is there any one of the eras that you identify more closely with that you think is a more accurate way to view the world? It's worth thinking about. So, as we've looked forward into the literature that we're going to read in the postmodern era, hopefully looking back at what we've previously studied and read and discussed has made postmodernism a little bit more clear. Thanks for listening.